Okay, one more time. For McIntyre, a tradition is a socially embodied, historically extended. So let me talk about those two ideas. First, a tradition is socially embodied. So so let's use America. Let me use America as an example. America believes something that we cannot prove. The Declaration of Independence begins this way: we hold these truths to be self evident. I think I mentioned this the other day, but whenever we use language like self evidence, that means it just seems right to us, but we don't have any way to prove this. So we hold these truths to be self evident that all people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. It was interesting. My very first philosophy paper, I actually wrote a paper disproving that, which is not all that hard to do. If we think of equality based in some kind of quantifiable essence of who we are, then it's very hard to prove equality. So, for example, if we were to measure everybody in class today, we'd all be different heights. If we were to have a race, everybody would run at different speeds. If we took an IQ test, we'd have various levels of IQ. If we looked at everybody's bank account, everybody would have, we'd be worth different amounts of money. So it's very, very difficult to figure out any way, any quantifiable way that humans are equal to each other. In fact, it's quite easy to prove the opposite, that we're in a plethora of ways very unequal from each other. However, we as a nation are built on this presupposition, this idea that we cannot prove, at least in terms of scientific methodology and quantifiable reasoning, that all people are created equal. It's really a sacred story that says all people are of intrinsic value and worth, endowed by their, in fact, we have to go listen to this language. We almost have to go to special revelation. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So there's no way to sort of quantifiably prove that we're equal. So what we have to do is we have to socially embody that. So America, in many ways, is an argument for equal rights, but the only way we can make that argument is to first socially embody it. So you can't make the argument without somehow living it out. So we have to embody it socially. We have to create a community in which all people are created equal and treated equally, and everyone has different rights. And it will be in the social embodiment of it then that this truth of equality is revealed. So as we live that out, our life together will be the argument of the equality and dignity of each person. As we live that out, people will see that, and there will be a resonance. So there ought to be something about a culture and community that does not treat one another as equals, that just feels untrue, that there's something that does not resonate with the reality of who we are to be. So there ought to be something attractive, for lack of a better term, about an American society when people truly are treated equally. So that's part of it. So socially embodied, then historically extended. So we're going to socially embody that, but then we've got to historically extend that. So here's the thing. Once you socially embody it, you got to see if it works. And it may work for a while, but then you run into conflicts that disprove the truthfulness of that. So in many ways, America is a 200 plus year argument now, socially embodied, for truths that we hold to be self-evident, that people are created equally. But you think about our history has come to great challenges in that. So, we weren't embodying that truth for very long before we had to have a conflict about whether people of color were equal to people to whites. So that you had this conflict over the issue of slavery and over the issue of equality that superseded the race of people, which was not an easy thing to overcome given human history. But for us, eventually, I think we had to get there, and we're still working on it, but we had to get there to the place where we could say, no matter what a person's race, that people should be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, to use MLK's words. So you have this historical extension that then wrestles with that. What does gender equality look like? What does that look like for us to then treat each other equally, whether we're male or female, so that you continue to have this constant sort of tension as the argument is extended historically. But if it's true, MacIntyre and other philosophers argue, if it's true, then it should be able to overcome those challenges with its core belief, its core essence still intact. If human equality is really true, then we should socially embody it in some way as a tradition, socially embody it in a way that it reflects that truthfulness. And then as it goes throughout history, it's able to live into that and embody that. So, one could make the argument that evidence against, especially communist socialism, has been its inability to historically sustain itself. Eventually, it falls apart. At least so far, it has. And so the argument for sort of a democratic liberalistic capitalism for America is that we've been able to socially embody it and historically extend it. But there's pressures on that. We'll see if capitalism, for example, can continue to be a truthful argument. If capitalism means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, eventually you can't sustain that. And so, all of that historical extension becomes part of the argument for whether this is a truthful existential, and I'm assuming you know what that word means. Existential philosophy is philosophy about our existence. It's nice to know about metaphysics, how things work, or physics and metaphysics, how things are put together. But then we end up with existential questions of meaning. And so this is where traditions are so important, because for MacIntyre, it's really at traditions that are socially embodied, historically extended arguments for existential truth that those two things become really important. So here's some other terms that become significant as we think about this. And this is really key. I need you to get this, because if you don't get this, you'll be confused all throughout the book that we're in, the Fitch book. But we'll really get lost when we get to Jamie Smith's book on Desiring the Kingdom, because these terms become really important to him and the argument he's making. So we have a tradition. And let me keep sticking with America here for a minute. The second word is telos. So the word telos means end. So we have some vision of where we're headed. If I could draw on the board today, I'd draw a big target. What's the target to which we're heading? What's the end, the purpose to which we as a people, as a community are heading? So again, back to America, we have a kind of vision of what our life together ought to look like, a society where rights are valued, where people are treated with dignity, and we have this sort of vision of what that looks like, of people sharing life together, people of different nations and ethnicities and races, all being able to be civil with each other and move forward with each other without having to resort to violence. That's sort of the vision, the teleological vision that shapes American life, the vision of a republic that works and values civility. But in order for that to happen, then, this third word becomes important. There have to be certain virtues, certain qualities about our life together in order to bring that telos into vision. And this is why when we do education, for example, think of the ways in which we do education with our young people. We do education then that tries to instill in them certain virtues. So when you go to kindergarten, they put you at a table with other people and you have to learn to cut and color and paste. But rather than sometimes everybody having their own crayons or everybody having their own pair of scissors, you have to learn to share, because that ability to share, the virtue of hospitality and sharing with others, is a virtue you've got to develop, because societies like ours don't work if we don't look out for one another. You have to do things like not only to develop the virtue of sharing, but virtues of citizenship, virtues of civility. So you can't talk until you raise your hand, and only one person can talk at a time. And when somebody's talking, everyone else listens. And all of those are attempts to develop certain virtues, because in order for this telos to happen, a community where people are treated with dignity and rights, then certain virtues have to be there. And so I think even one of the challenges we see with our culture today, as we think about the divisiveness and the ways in which we're becoming so bipartisan, some of the conversation about why that is so disconcerting has to do with, because if if we're intolerant of each other and we can't be civil to each other, then our sight isn't work, because we have to have those virtues for it to work. And then fourth, you have stories, you have narratives. So you tell narratives, you tell stories about times when this worked well, and maybe stories when it didn't work well. You tell stories about heroes who embodied that. So the Lincoln movie is going to come out in a month or so, and it's going to win all the awards. And in part, it's probably a really well done movie, but for Americans, Lincoln embodies the costliness of citizenship, the civility to invite people of other parties into his cabinet. So Lincoln becomes this narrative that embodies us. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a sort of story and narrative. All of those kinds of heroes and stories become stories that we tell, and so we want children to know their history, not just so they can take a test and pass it, but because those stories are important to shaping those virtues and to knowing who we are and to continuing that story. And we may tell stories of people who did it badly, because that also is something we learn from the places and times when democracy falls apart. And then fifth, then there are certain practices that we have to develop. And so you don't just become a good citizen by hearing lectures about good citizenship. You have to go on the playground and learn to share the ball together. You have to go to speech class and learn to give speeches so that you can clearly articulate your viewpoint. You have to write well. You have to do all of those. There's just practices that we do that undergird our citizenship. You have to do community projects. So all of those become practices that develop that socially embodied, historically extended tradition. So all five of those are important. So again, I got to stop here for a minute, and I'll come back and say, why in the world is this important in a practical theology class? Be right back.